I thought my husband was asleep beside me. But when I woke up that night, the bed was empty.
Before the story begins, let me greet you. Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today. Stories like this travel across many cities and many lives, so before we begin, take a second and tell me where you are watching from. I enjoy seeing how far our community reaches. If you enjoy powerful stories about choices, relationships, and life lessons, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. The street rested in deep silence beneath the soft glow of a single street lamp. Midnight had already passed in the quiet California neighborhood. Most houses stood dark, their windows closed and their families asleep. A light breeze moved through the palm trees that lined the sidewalks, brushing gently against parked cars and empty driveways. Inside one of the homes on the street, Elena Morales slept peacefully. For years, nights in the Morales house followed the same calm rhythm. Elena and her husband, Javier Morales, would turn off the lights together, share a few quiet words, and fall asleep before the world outside began another day. But tonight, something felt wrong. Elena stirred slightly, her eyes opening as an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. The bed beside her felt strangely empty. Half awake, she reached her hand across the mattress, expecting to feel Javier's warm shoulder beside her. Instead, her fingers touched only cold sheets. Elena blinked slowly, trying to clear the heaviness of sleep from her eyes. For a moment she remained still, listening to the quiet house around her. The digital clock on the bedside table glowed softly in the dark. 12:47 a.m. Her gaze moved again to the empty space beside her. Javier rarely left the bed during the night. Even when he worked late hours at his architecture firm in San Diego, he usually slept deeply once he returned home. Elena pushed the blanket aside and sat up. The bedroom felt cooler than usual. The faint hum of the air conditioner filled the silence, along with the distant ticking of a wall clock in the hallway. She glanced toward the bathroom door. The light was off. The hallway outside their room remained dark as well. A quiet unease moved through her chest as she slipped her feet onto the floor. If Javier was not in the bedroom, where was he at this hour? Elena stood quietly beside the bed, her eyes adjusting to the dim light inside the room. For a moment she considered walking into the hallway to search for Javier, but something made her pause. A faint glow slipped through the curtains near the window. It came from outside. Curious, Elena walked slowly toward the glass window that overlooked the front of their house. The neighborhood street stretched calmly beneath the soft yellow light of a tall street lamp. Everything appeared normal at first. Parked cars rested along the curb. The sidewalk lay empty. Palm trees swayed gently in the night breeze. Then her eyes moved toward the driveway across the street. Her breath caught slightly. A figure stood there. Even from the second floor, Elena recognized the shape immediately. The tall frame, the familiar posture, the way he shifted his weight slightly while standing still. Javier, her husband, stood outside near the neighbor's driveway long after midnight. Elena leaned slightly closer to the window, her heart beating faster as she tried to understand what she was seeing. Javier stood near the edge of the neighbor's driveway, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his jacket. The quiet street lamp above him cast a soft circle of light across the pavement. He was not walking. He was waiting. Elena frowned, confusion tightening inside her chest. Javier had never mentioned leaving the house tonight. He had gone to bed beside her only hours earlier. Why would he be standing outside at this hour? Her eyes moved toward the front door of the house across the street. The neighbor's porch remained dark for a moment. Then the door opened slowly. A soft line of light stretched across the front steps as someone stepped outside. Elena's breath grew shallow. It was the woman who had moved into that house 3 months earlier, and she walked directly toward Javier. Elena froze beside the window, her fingers tightening slightly against the curtain as she watched the scene unfold below. The neighbor walked down her driveway with slow, relaxed steps, as if this meeting had been expected. The porch light behind her faded as the door closed, leaving the two figures standing beneath the street lamp. Javier stepped forward. For a moment they simply stood facing each other, speaking quietly. Elena could not hear their voices from the second floor, but their calm movements told her this was not a brief or accidental encounter. Javier leaned slightly closer while the woman lifted her head toward him. Their conversation appeared comfortable, familiar. Elena's heart pounded harder in her chest as the truth she feared began forming in her mind. Down on the silent street, the distance between Javier and the neighbor slowly disappeared. Then she saw Javier reach out toward the woman, and the two of them moved closer together. Several months earlier, the Morales home stood filled with warmth and quiet happiness. Morning sunlight spilled across the calm California street, lighting rows of tidy houses and small gardens. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks, while neighbors watered plants and exchanged friendly greetings before leaving for work. Inside the Morales house, Elena moved through the kitchen preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, while soft music played from a small speaker near the window. Through the glass, she watched the peaceful neighborhood that had become their home 3 years earlier. Javier entered the kitchen moments later, adjusting the sleeves of his shirt as he walked toward the table. "Morning," he said with a relaxed smile. Elena returned the smile as she placed a plate in front of him. Their mornings felt easy during those months. They spoke about weekend plans, work schedules, and small ideas for improving the house. Life felt steady, calm, and full of quiet promise. Weekends in the Morales home followed a rhythm Elena had grown to love. Saturday mornings often began slowly. Sunlight streamed through the wide living room windows, while the neighborhood outside filled with relaxed weekend activity. Families walked their dogs, children played basketball in nearby driveways, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through open kitchen windows. Javier usually handled breakfast on Saturdays. He moved around the kitchen with playful confidence, preparing eggs and toast, while Elena sat at the counter watching him with amusement. Sometimes music played softly, while they talked about movies they wanted to see or places they hoped to visit along the California coast. After breakfast, they often walked through the neighborhood together. Javier greeted neighbors easily, always friendly and welcoming. Elena admired how comfortable he felt around people. Their home had become a peaceful place where laughter came naturally. Looking back later, Elena would remember those quiet weekends as some of the happiest moments of their marriage. The neighborhood had a friendly rhythm that made daily life feel comfortable. Neighbors greeted each other during evening walks. Some families gathered outside while children rode scooters along the sidewalks. Small conversations often happened near mailboxes or across fences as people returned home from work. Elena enjoyed those simple interactions. Many afternoons she worked in the small garden near their front porch while Javier arrived home from the office. He would loosen his tie, step onto the driveway, and wave to the neighbors before joining her outside. Their home slowly became part of the street's routine. One couple lived 2 houses down and often invited them for casual dinners. Another neighbor helped Javier repair the backyard fence during the summer. Life moved with an easy sense of community. Everyone seemed to know each other, and most evenings ended with quiet streets and glowing porch lights. At that time, Elena believed the neighborhood was the perfect place to build their future together. One warm afternoon in early spring, a large moving truck arrived at the empty house across the street. Elena noticed it while watering the small flowers along their front porch. Workers carried boxes through the open door while the driver guided the truck slowly into the driveway. Javier stepped outside beside her, shielding his eyes from the sun as he looked toward the activity. "Looks like we're getting new neighbors," he said. Elena nodded with interest. The house had remained empty for several months, and the sudden movement across the street brought fresh curiosity to the quiet neighborhood. Soon a woman stepped out of the front door, speaking with the movers while pointing toward different rooms inside the house. She appeared confident and calm, dressed casually, while organizing the move with careful attention. Javier watched the scene for a moment before walking across the street. Elena followed more slowly, ready to welcome the newest person joining their neighborhood community. The woman introduced herself as Valeria Cruz. She thanked them warmly for coming over and explained that she had recently moved from Los Angeles after accepting a position at a marketing firm in San Diego. Her voice carried easy confidence, and she spoke with a friendly smile that made conversation flow naturally. Javier offered to help carry one of the smaller boxes from the truck. Valeria laughed lightly and told him she would appreciate the help. Elena watched as the two walked toward the truck together while the movers continued unloading furniture. At first, everything felt completely normal. Neighbors often helped each other during moves, and Elena enjoyed seeing their street welcome someone new. Still, as they returned to their driveway later that afternoon, Elena noticed Javier glance across the street again. Valeria stood near her porch speaking with one of the movers. Javier paused for a moment, watching her before finally turning back toward the house. At first, the changes in Javier felt small enough to ignore. Life in the Morales home continued as usual. Elena still prepared breakfast most mornings, and Javier left early for his architecture office downtown. Evenings remained calm, with dinner conversations and quiet television before bed. Yet Elena slowly noticed that Javier spent more time outside the house. Some evenings he stepped onto the front porch after dinner and remained there longer than usual. He said he needed fresh air after sitting in meetings all day. Other nights he walked slowly down the driveway and stood near the sidewalk, watching the street as cars passed. Elena often watched him through the kitchen window while washing dishes. She told herself he simply enjoyed the calm of their neighborhood. Still, a faint question began forming in her mind. Javier had always relaxed inside the house with her after work. Now he seemed drawn outside more often. As the weeks passed, Javier's time outside slowly turned into late evening walks. At first he mentioned it casually during dinner. He said the walks helped clear his mind after long hours at the office. Elena understood. His job often demanded careful attention and constant meetings with clients. So when Javier began stepping outside after sunset, she thought little of it. He would return 20 or 30 minutes later, relaxed and quiet. But the walks soon became a regular routine. Some nights Elena noticed him leaving the house just as the neighborhood lights began turning on. Other evenings, he waited until the street grew quieter. She began paying closer attention without meaning to. One night she looked through the living room window and saw Javier standing near the sidewalk across the street. Valeria stood nearby, speaking with him beside her front gate. They appeared comfortable, continuing their conversation while the rest of the street slowly settled into night. After that evening, Elena began noticing how often Javier and Valeria spoke. At first, their conversations happened casually during the day. Sometimes, Elena saw them greeting each other while collecting mail or watering plants in their yards. Other times, Javier leaned over the low fence that separated the properties while Valeria stood near her garden. Their voices carried lightly across the quiet street, followed by easy laughter. Elena told herself there was nothing unusual about friendly neighbors talking. The entire neighborhood often shared small conversations outside. Still, something about their growing comfort unsettled her. Javier seemed especially relaxed when speaking with Valeria. His smile appeared wider, his posture more open. From the kitchen window, Elena sometimes watched these brief exchanges while preparing dinner. She never joined the conversations. Instead, she remained inside, quietly finishing her tasks while wondering why Javier seemed more animated across the street than he did at home. Inside the house, Elena slowly began to feel the distance growing between them. Dinner conversations shortened. Javier still sat across from her at the table, but he often seemed distracted, his attention drifting toward his phone or the television. Sometimes Elena asked about his day at the office. His answers became brief. "Busy," he would say, while taking another bite of food. Other evenings he excused himself early, saying he needed a short walk to clear his mind. Elena watched these changes quietly. She reminded herself that people often went through stressful periods at work. Javier managed large projects and carried the pressure of many responsibilities. Still, the warmth that once filled their evenings felt different now. They spoke less about future plans, vacations, or small ideas for improving the house. Instead, the rooms seemed quieter. Sometimes Elena stood near the kitchen window, staring across the street, wondering why her home suddenly felt less connected than before. One evening, Elena stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a plate while the last colors of sunset faded outside. The window above the sink faced the street, giving her a clear view of the houses across from theirs. Porch lights began turning on one by one as the neighborhood prepared for night. Javier stepped outside through the front door a moment later. Elena noticed his reflection in the window as he walked down the driveway. Her hands slowed beneath the running water. Across the street, Valeria stood near her mailbox. Javier stopped beside her. From the kitchen window, Elena could see them speaking quietly. Valeria laughed at something Javier said, tilting her head slightly as she listened. Javier smiled in return. The expression on his face caught Elena's attention. It was relaxed and warm, the same smile he once shared easily at home. Elena remained still at the sink, watching silently as the two continued talking beneath the streetlight. The first moment that unsettled Elena came during a quiet evening at home. They were sitting in the living room after dinner. A soft lamp lit the corner near the couch while the television played quietly in the background. Javier held his phone in one hand, scrolling through messages. Elena sat beside him reading a magazine, occasionally glancing toward the screen as the light from his phone reflected faintly across his face. Then the phone vibrated. Javier reacted quickly. He turned the screen slightly away from her and lowered the brightness before opening the message. The movement was small, almost automatic, but Elena noticed it immediately. She looked down at her magazine again, pretending not to pay attention. For the next few minutes, Javier typed short replies, his attention fixed on the phone. When Elena finally asked who he was speaking with, Javier slipped the phone into his pocket. "Just someone from work," he answered casually. Dinner conversations slowly changed in ways Elena could not ignore. One evening she placed 2 plates on the dining table while Javier sat across from her, quietly checking messages on his phone. The room felt calm, yet the silence between them seemed heavier than before. Elena tried to begin a conversation. "How was your meeting today?" she asked gently. Javier looked up briefly. "Fine," he replied, then returned his attention to the phone beside his plate. Elena waited, hoping he would say more, but the moment passed. They ate quietly for several minutes. The sounds of forks touching plates filled the space where their conversations once lived. Elena remembered how dinners used to stretch into long talks about travel, family, and plans for the future. Now their evenings ended faster. Javier often finished his meal and stepped outside soon after, saying he needed a little air before going to bed. Valeria also seemed to appear near their home more often. At first, Elena noticed her during ordinary moments. Sometimes Valeria walked past their house while speaking on her phone. Other times she stood near the sidewalk checking the mail or watering the plants near her porch. Each time Javier seemed to be nearby as well. One afternoon, Elena looked out the living room window and saw the two of them standing beside the fence that separated their properties. Valeria leaned against the railing while Javier rested his arms on the wooden boards. They spoke quietly, their conversation lasting longer than most neighborly greetings. Elena watched for a moment before stepping away from the window. She reminded herself again that neighbors often talked like this. The street had always been friendly, and Javier enjoyed casual conversation. Still, the pattern continued repeating. Whenever Valeria appeared outside, Javier somehow seemed to be there too. One night Elena noticed another change. They had gone to bed later than usual after finishing a movie together. The house felt quiet, and the neighborhood outside had already settled into sleep. Elena turned onto her side, expecting the familiar calm that usually followed their evenings. Instead, she heard the soft glow of Javier's phone lighting the room. The screen cast a faint blue light across the blankets. Elena kept her eyes closed, pretending to sleep. Beside her, Javier typed slowly, pausing between messages as if carefully choosing his words. The phone vibrated once again before he responded. After a few minutes, he lowered the brightness and turned slightly away from her. Elena opened her eyes just enough to see the light reflecting across his face. His expression looked focused, quiet, almost careful. The glow from the phone remained in the darkness for several minutes before he finally placed it on the nightstand. Later that same night, Elena woke again. The bedroom was dark except for the faint glow of Javier's phone resting on the nightstand. At first, she thought the vibration had been part of a dream, but the soft buzz came again. She turned her head slowly. A new message lit the screen. The brightness briefly filled the quiet room before the light began fading. Elena hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should look. Curiosity finally pulled her attention toward the phone. From her side of the bed, she could see part of the message preview before the screen dimmed again. The name at the top caught her breath. Valeria. Elena stared at the dark phone for several seconds, her heart beating harder as the meaning of that single name settled heavily in her mind. Beside her, Javier remained asleep, unaware that the message had appeared. The name on the phone screen stayed in Elena's mind long after the message faded. The next morning she moved through the kitchen preparing breakfast, while Javier dressed for work upstairs. The quiet house gave her too much time to think. Valeria. The message could have meant many things. Neighbors sometimes exchanged numbers for simple reasons. Maybe she needed help with something around the house. Elena repeated those thoughts while pouring coffee. Yet the uneasy feeling inside her refused to disappear. Javier entered the kitchen and greeted her with a casual smile. He kissed her lightly on the cheek and sat down at the table as if nothing had changed. Elena studied his face for a moment. Should she ask him about the message? The question pressed heavily against her thoughts, but another part of her hesitated. If she asked too soon, Javier might simply deny everything. For most of the day, Elena carried the question in silence. She tried to focus on her work and the small routines that filled her afternoons, but her thoughts kept returning to the same moment in the dark bedroom. Valeria's name glowing on Javier's phone. Several times, Elena imagined confronting him directly. She pictured herself asking calmly across the dinner table, "Why is Valeria messaging you late at night?" But every time she imagined the conversation, doubt followed. If Javier denied it, what proof would she have? A single
Then came the moment I couldn't ignore. The late-night messages. The phone turning away from me.
message preview did not explain everything. By the time evening arrived, Elena had reached a quiet decision. She would not confront him yet. Instead, she would watch. Not with anger, not with accusations, with patience. If something truly existed between Javier and the neighbor, the truth would reveal itself through small patterns over time. From that day forward, Elena began noticing details she had once ignored. She paid attention to the times Javier checked his phone during dinner. She noticed how quickly he turned the screen away when messages arrived. Each small movement that once seemed ordinary now held new meaning. In the evenings, she moved quietly around the house, observing the rhythm of their routine. Javier still stepped outside after dinner, claiming he needed a short walk to relax after work. Elena watched from the living room window as he crossed the driveway. Across the street, Valeria's porch light often glowed softly in the dark. Sometimes, Javier walked past her house slowly. Other nights, he stopped near the sidewalk where the two of them spoke, in quiet voices. Elena remained inside, standing still behind the curtain, gathering these moments silently, while her mind slowly formed a clearer picture. Over the next several days, Elena noticed the pattern becoming clearer. Javier often stepped outside around the same time each evening. The moment dinner ended, he would stand, stretch casually, and mention needing a short walk before bed. Elena no longer responded with surprise. Instead, she watched quietly. One evening, she stood in the hallway as Javier reached for the front door. He moved carefully, opening it slowly to avoid making noise. The soft click of the door closing echoed through the quiet house. Elena remained still in the dim hallway, listening to his footsteps fade outside. Her heart beat faster, not from anger, but from the heavy awareness growing inside her. She was beginning to understand that these late walks were not random. They followed a pattern, and patterns often carried meaning that people tried to hide. One night, Elena decided to stay awake longer than usual. She turned off the bedroom lamp and lay quietly beneath the blankets, her eyes closed while she listened to the calm sounds of the house. Beside her, Javier breathed slowly, appearing asleep. Minutes passed. Then he shifted. Elena kept her breathing steady while Javier carefully moved out of bed. The mattress lifted slightly as his weight disappeared. She heard the soft rustle of clothing and the quiet movement of his steps across the room. A moment later, the bedroom door opened. Elena waited until the hallway light faded again before slipping out of bed. She stepped into the hallway just in time to hear the front door closing gently below. Standing there in the dim silence, Elena walked toward the window overlooking the street. Outside, beneath the distant street lamp, she saw Javier moving across the driveway toward the road. After that night, Elena began paying attention to every detail of Javier's late movements. The pattern continued almost immediately. Each evening followed the same calm routine. They finished dinner together, washed the dishes, and watched a short program in the living room before going upstairs. Javier behaved normally during those hours, speaking casually and occasionally smiling, as if nothing unusual existed between them. But Elena no longer believed the quiet surface of their evenings. When bedtime arrived, she lay beside him and pretended to sleep. Her breathing remained slow and steady while she waited in silence. Several nights passed before Javier moved again, but when he did, the movement followed the same careful rhythm she had already noticed. He slipped quietly from the bed. He dressed without turning on the lights. Then he stepped out of the room. Elena listened as the soft sound of his footsteps crossed the hallway. Moments later, the faint click of the front door reached her ears. Once again, Javier had left the house long after midnight. Elena remained still in the darkness, her heart heavy as the growing pattern became impossible to ignore. The next night, Elena repeated the same quiet routine. She lay on her side of the bed with her eyes closed, her breathing slow, and even while the house settled into silence, outside the neighborhood looked peaceful beneath the faint glow of distant streetlights. Beside her, Javier shifted slightly in his sleep. Minutes passed. Then the movement began again. Elena heard the soft rustle of blankets as Javier carefully slid out of bed. The mattress lifted as his weight disappeared, and his footsteps crossed the bedroom floor with careful control. He moved the way someone moves when trying not to wake another person. Elena kept her eyes closed while he dressed in the darkness. The bedroom door opened slowly. A moment later, it closed again. Downstairs, the front door clicked quietly. Elena opened her eyes and sat up. She walked toward the window that overlooked the street and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see outside. Across the street, a single porch light turned on. Valeria's house. Elena stood quietly behind the curtain, watching the quiet street. Javier crossed their driveway and moved toward the sidewalk with slow, careful steps. The neighborhood remained peaceful, the only sound coming from distant traffic far beyond the houses. Across the street, Valeria's porch light continued glowing. The pattern became clear as Elena watched. Javier did not wander through the neighborhood the way he once claimed. He walked directly toward the same place every time. Toward Valeria's house. He stopped near the edge of her driveway, standing beneath the warm circle of light from the porch. For a moment, he simply waited. Then the front door opened. Valeria stepped outside. Even from the distance, Elena could see the ease between them. They greeted each other quietly, speaking in calm voices that never reached the window. Elena felt a heavy weight settle inside her chest. This was not a coincidence. It was a routine, and routines did not form without reason. Still, Elena remained silent, watching from the darkness while the truth slowly built itself in front of her eyes. Over the following nights, Elena watched the same quiet scene repeat itself. Each evening she prepared for bed beside Javier, pretending that nothing had changed. She listened to his breathing grow steady and waited patiently in the darkness. Soon the familiar movement would come. Javier slipping from the bed. Javier dressing quietly. Javier leaving the room with careful steps. The pattern rarely changed. Elena no longer needed to rush to the window. She already knew what she would see outside. Still, she looked every time. Across the street, Valeria's porch light turned on again and again. The warm glow cut through the quiet darkness like a signal meant for one person alone. Javier always walked directly toward it. Sometimes he stayed near the sidewalk while Valeria stood by the porch. Other nights they met halfway along the driveway, speaking softly in the still air. Elena could not hear their words, but their comfort with each other spoke clearly enough. With every passing night, the uncertainty inside her faded. In its place grew a painful certainty she could no longer ignore. By the end of the week, Elena no longer felt surprised when Javier left the house after midnight. The quiet routine had become familiar. Still, the growing certainty inside her carried a quiet ache she could not ignore. One evening she remained in the hallway instead of returning to the bedroom window. From that spot she could hear everything. Javier's slow footsteps moving across the living room, the gentle turn of the front door handle, the soft closing of the door behind him. Elena stood there in the dim light, staring toward the entrance as the silence returned to the house. For a long moment she did not move. Her mind replayed every night she had watched from the window. Every quiet meeting, every glowing porch light. A deep breath filled her lungs as she made a new decision. Watching from inside the house was no longer enough. If she wanted the truth, she needed to see more than distant shadows beneath a street lamp. Slowly, Elena reached for the light sweater hanging beside the door. Tonight, she would follow him. Elena stepped outside carefully, closing the front door behind her without making a sound. The night air felt cool against her skin as she stood on the porch, listening. The neighborhood remained quiet, just as it had every other night. Palm trees swayed gently along the sidewalks while distant traffic hummed far away beyond the houses. Ahead of her, Javier walked toward the street. He moved slowly, unaware that Elena now followed several steps behind. She stayed near the shadow of their driveway, keeping her distance while watching him cross the road. Across the street, Valeria's porch light glowed warmly. Javier stopped at the edge of the driveway, exactly where Elena had seen him many times from the bedroom window. For a moment he stood still, looking toward the front door of the house. Elena's heart pounded as she watched from the darkness. Then the door opened. Valeria stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind her before walking down the porch steps. She moved toward Javier with calm familiarity. Neither of them looked surprised to see the other waiting. Elena remained still near the edge of her driveway, her body hidden partly by the shadow of a parked car. From that distance, she could see them clearly beneath the glow of Valeria's porch light. Javier stepped closer as Valeria approached. They did not greet each other the way neighbors usually did during the day. There was no brief wave or quick exchange of words before returning home. Instead, they stood facing each other with a quiet comfort that felt deeper than casual conversation. Valeria spoke first. Elena could not hear the words, but she saw Javier smile as he listened. The expression on his face carried a warmth that Elena had not seen directed toward her in many weeks. The two of them continued talking softly. Javier leaned slightly forward as Valeria spoke again, their voices low enough that the still night swallowed every sound. From where Elena stood, their closeness felt unmistakable. This was not the distant conversation of two neighbors greeting each other across a fence. This was something more personal. Elena's chest tightened as she continued watching. The quiet space between Javier and Valeria slowly grew smaller. Their conversation carried the relaxed ease of people who had shared many moments together before. Javier shifted closer. Valeria tilted her head slightly as she listened to him speak. Even without hearing the words, Elena could see how natural their connection appeared. They stood comfortably beneath the porch light, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that revealed familiarity. Javier laughed softly at something Valeria said. The sound did not reach Elena's ears, but the expression on his face told the story clearly. For a moment, Elena felt the ground beneath her feet lose its steady balance. This was the same smile she had once seen across their dinner table. The same warmth that once filled their quiet evenings at home. Now it lives here, across the street. Elena felt a wave of pain rise in her chest, as the truth settled firmly in her heart. Elena remained frozen where she stood, unable to look away from the scene unfolding across the street. The quiet night seemed to grow heavier around her as Javier and Valeria continued speaking beneath the porch light. Their voices stayed low, but their expressions revealed more than words could carry. Javier stepped closer. Valeria did not move away. Instead, she leaned slightly toward him, her posture relaxed and comfortable. The distance between them disappeared, until they stood only a step apart. Elena felt her breath catch in her chest. For weeks she had watched small moments from behind windows and curtains, trying to convince herself there might be another explanation. But standing here now, seeing them together without walls or distance between them, the truth became impossible to deny. This was not a simple friendship between neighbors. Their quiet closeness carried something deeper. Elena felt a sharp ache spread through her chest as the last pieces of doubt faded away. The uncertainty that once filled her mind had finally ended. For a long moment, neither Javier nor Valeria moved. They stood beneath the soft porch light while the quiet neighborhood remained asleep around them. The still air carried only the faint rustle of palm leaves along the street. Elena watched from the darkness, her heart pounding as every second stretched longer than the last. Javier spoke again. Valeria lowered her gaze for a moment, then looked back up at him. The expression on her face appeared gentle, almost thoughtful. Then she lifted her hand. Slowly she reached toward Javier. Her fingers brushed against his. Javier did not pull away. Instead, he allowed his hand to remain there, their fingers touching lightly in the warm circle of light. From across the street, Elena felt the final weight of the truth settle heavily inside her chest. The quiet hope she had held onto for weeks finally disappeared. The distance between them had become something real. Elena stood silently in the shadows, watching the moment that confirmed everything she feared. Morning sunlight filled the Morales kitchen the next day, casting soft light across the wooden table near the window. Everything looked normal. The coffee machine hummed quietly, while the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the room. Outside, the California street had returned to its peaceful routine. Neighbors walked dogs, Cars passed slowly, and the calm morning air carried the usual sounds of daily life. But inside the house, Elena felt none of that calm. She sat at the table with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, staring at the surface of the drink while her mind replayed the moment she had witnessed the night before. Javier entered the kitchen a few minutes later. He looked the same as always. His hair was still slightly damp from the shower, and he wore his usual work shirt as he reached for a cup of coffee. "Morning," he said casually. Elena did not answer immediately. She looked up slowly, meeting his eyes across the table. For the first time in weeks, the silence between them felt heavy with something neither of them could ignore. Elena set her cup down gently. "Javier," she said quietly, "we need to talk." Javier paused with the coffee cup halfway to his lips. Something in Elena's voice made him lower the cup slowly back to the counter. He looked at her more carefully now, as if trying to read the meaning behind her calm tone. "What's wrong?" he asked. Elena held his gaze. The words she had rehearsed in her mind throughout the night now pressed forward. "I saw you last night." Javier's expression tightened slightly. Elena continued before he could answer. "I saw you outside," she said. "Across the street." The silence that followed felt sharp and heavy. For a moment, Javier said nothing. His eyes moved away from hers as he stared down at the kitchen counter. Elena watched the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened as he stood there quietly. "You went to see Valeria," she said. The name hung in the air between them. Javier exhaled slowly, running a hand across the back of his neck as if searching for the right words. But the longer he remained silent, the more Elena felt the truth pressing closer to the surface. Javier finally pulled out a chair and sat down across from Elena. For a moment he stared at the table, his hands resting loosely in front of him. The quiet room seemed smaller now, the air filled with tension that had waited weeks to appear. "Elena," he began slowly. She waited. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, steady and calm despite the pain pressing against her chest. Javier sighed. "It's not what you think," he said quietly. Elena felt a small spark of frustration rise inside her. "I watched you," she replied. Her voice remained soft, but the certainty in it left little space for denial. "I saw the way you stood with her. I saw how close you were." Javier's eyes lifted toward hers again. For a moment the two of them simply looked at each other across the table. Years of shared memories sat silently between them. Finally, Elena spoke again. "Just tell me the truth," she said. "What is happening between you and Valeria?" Javier leaned back slightly in the chair, his hands tightening together. For several seconds, he said nothing. Elena could see the conflict in his face. His eyes moved briefly toward the window, where morning light spilled across the quiet street outside. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded lower than before. "It started as simple conversations," he said. Elena remained silent. "She moved in across the street, and we talked a few times outside," Javier continued. "At first it was just normal neighbor things." His words came slowly, as if he were choosing them carefully. "We both work long hours. Sometimes we ran into each other late in the evening. We talked about work, about life." Elena felt a dull ache settle in her chest. "And that led to secret meetings after midnight?" she asked. Javier lowered his eyes again. "I didn't plan it like that," he replied. The quiet honesty in his voice made the room feel even heavier. Elena understood now that he was no longer trying to deny it. Elena sat quietly, absorbing every word. The kitchen felt still except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. Morning light continued filling the room, but the warmth of the day outside did nothing to soften the tension between them. Javier finally looked up again. "There is something I need to be honest about," he said. Elena braced herself. He took a slow breath before speaking. "I never meant for things to reach this point. At first we were just talking. It felt easy to speak with her. She listened in ways that made the conversations feel simple." Elena felt a sharp wave of pain move through her chest. "And what about me?" she asked quietly. Javier hesitated. "That's the problem," he admitted. His voice carried a tired honesty now. Somewhere along the way, those conversations started meaning more than they should have. The words hung heavily in the room. "I didn't plan it," he continued softly, "but I can't pretend anymore. I developed feelings for her. Before the story continues, I want to ask you something. Do you believe emotional betrayal is as serious as physical betrayal?" Share your thoughts in the comments. Elena did not respond immediately after Javier finished speaking. The kitchen remained silent, except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, the neighborhood continued its peaceful morning routine, unaware of the quiet storm unfolding inside the Morales home. She slowly stood from the table and walked toward the window. Sunlight spread across the quiet California street. Cars moved calmly along the road while a neighbor watered plants near the sidewalk. Everything outside appeared ordinary, untouched by the painful truth that had just entered her life. Behind her, Javier remained seated. Elena could feel his eyes on her back as she looked through the glass. Memories began rising in her mind. The early days of their marriage, the excitement of buying their first home together, the late-night conversations about dreams and plans they had once shared so easily. For years, she believed their life had been built on trust. Now she understood that something inside their relationship had slowly changed. Elena rested her hand lightly against the window frame, breathing slowly as she began thinking about what came next. Elena remained near the window for several moments, letting her thoughts move slowly through years of memories. She remembered the early days with Javier when their relationship felt effortless. They had supported each other through demanding careers and long work hours. When they first moved into this house, they spoke often about the future they hoped to build together. Those memories still mattered. Yet standing there now, Elena understood something else. The quiet distance that had grown between them did not appear overnight. It had formed through many small moments neither of them had fully addressed. She turned slowly back toward the kitchen table. Javier was still sitting there, his hands folded together as he waited. "Do you want to leave?" Elena asked calmly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. Javier looked down again, searching for an answer. "I don't know," he said quietly. The uncertainty in his voice did not bring Elena anger. Instead, it brought a clear realization. Whatever decision came next would have to come from her. Elena returned to the table and sat down again, facing Javier. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt tense. Instead, it carried the weight of years spent together, the memories of choices they had once made side by side. "I keep thinking about how we started," Elena said quietly. Javier lifted his eyes toward her. "You worked long hours even back then," she continued. "But we still talked about everything. Even small things felt important." Her voice remained calm, though her chest felt tight. Somewhere along the way that stopped. Javier listened without interrupting. Elena could see the regret in his expression, but regret alone could not repair what had changed. "I'm not angry right now," she said honestly. "I'm trying to understand how two people who once shared everything ended up feeling like strangers sitting at the same table." Javier exhaled slowly. "I wish I had noticed the distance sooner," he admitted. Elena nodded quietly. "But noticing it now doesn't erase what already happened." The conversation ended quietly after that. Javier eventually left for work, moving slowly through the house before stepping out the front door. Elena watched him from the living room as his car pulled away from the driveway and disappeared down the street. The house felt unusually empty after he left. Elena walked upstairs to their bedroom, standing in the doorway for a moment before entering. The room looked exactly the same as it had the night before, yet everything about it now felt different. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes moving across the familiar space. The dresser where Javier kept his watch, the framed photo from their first vacation together, the closet door slightly open. Elena stood and walked toward the closet slowly. Her hand rested against the shelf where a small suitcase had been stored for years. It had traveled with them on holidays and short weekend trips along the California coast. Today, it carried a different meaning. Elena pulled the suitcase down carefully and placed it on the bed. Elena stood beside the bed for several seconds, staring at the suitcase resting on the blankets. The room
I realized the life I thought I had was already gone. But the story didn't end there.
felt quiet and unfamiliar, even though every object inside it carried memories of the life she had built with Javier. The framed photograph on the dresser showed them smiling during a trip to Santa Barbara years earlier. At the time, their future had seemed simple and certain. Elena opened the suitcase slowly. The soft click of the zipper breaking the silence sounded louder than expected in the empty room. She walked to the closet and reached for a few pieces of clothing. Each movement felt calm and deliberate. She was not acting out of anger or sudden emotion. Instead, she felt a quiet clarity settling inside her. Some relationships survive painful moments. Others reveal truths that cannot be ignored. Elena folded the first shirt and placed it inside the suitcase. Outside the bedroom window, the peaceful California street continued its normal rhythm. Inside the room, Elena began packing the first pieces of a life she was preparing to change. The next morning arrived quietly. Soft sunlight stretched across the California neighborhood as the first light of day touched the rooftops and palm trees along the street. Birds moved between the branches, while a light breeze carried the cool air of early morning. Inside the Morales house, Elena stood near the bedroom window. Her suitcase rested on the floor beside the bed. She had spent most of the night thinking, not crying, not arguing, but reflecting on the life she had built and the truth she had finally accepted. The pain still existed, but alongside that pain came a calm clarity she had not felt in weeks. Across the street, Valeria's house looked no different than any other home in the neighborhood. For a moment, Elena allowed herself to feel the sadness of what had changed. Then she turned away from the window. Downstairs, she could hear the quiet sound of Javier moving through the kitchen. He had returned home late the previous evening and spent the night on the couch. Today would be the first morning of a different life. Elena carried the suitcase downstairs slowly. Each step felt steady, guided by the decision she had made during the long hours of the night. When she reached the bottom of the staircase, she paused for a moment before entering the kitchen. Javier stood near the counter, holding a coffee cup. He looked tired. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes as if sleep had barely visited him. When he noticed Elena standing there with the suitcase beside her, his expression tightened with quiet understanding. Neither of them spoke immediately. The morning light entered through the kitchen window, casting soft shadows across the table where they had shared so many ordinary breakfasts together. "I thought about everything," Elena said finally. Her voice remained calm. Javier set his coffee cup down slowly. "I know I hurt you," he replied. The honesty in his tone carried no excuses. Elena nodded once. "Yes," she said quietly. Then she lifted the suitcase handle and walked toward the front door. Javier did not try to stop her. Elena stepped outside into the quiet morning air. The neighborhood looked peaceful beneath the early sunlight. The same streets that once held her happiest memories now felt like the beginning of something new. She walked toward her car parked along the curb. Behind her, the front door opened softly. Javier stepped onto the porch. "Elena," he called gently. She paused beside the car but did not turn immediately. When she finally faced him, he stood there looking uncertain, as if searching for words that might change what was already happening. "I'm sorry," he said. The words carried genuine regret. Elena studied his face for a moment. "I believe you," she replied calmly. The answer seemed to surprise him. But some apologies arrive after the damage is already done. Javier lowered his gaze. Elena felt sadness for the years they had shared, yet the decision inside her remained steady. "Take care of yourself, Javier," she said quietly. Then she opened the car door and placed the suitcase inside. Elena sat behind the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine. The quiet street stretched ahead of her beneath the warm California sunlight. A few neighbors had begun their morning routines, walking dogs or collecting newspapers from their driveways. None of them knew the story that had unfolded during the night. Elena looked once more toward the house she had shared with Javier. He still stood on the porch, watching her with a heavy expression. The distance between them felt larger now, not because of the street that separated them, but because of the truth they both understood. Elena took a slow breath. Pain remained in her chest, yet something else had begun to grow beside it. Strength. She turned the key, and the car engine started quietly. As she pulled away from the curb, sunlight reflected across the windshield. The peaceful neighborhood slowly disappeared behind her, while the open road ahead carried the promise of a different life. For the first time in weeks, Elena felt the quiet beginning of hope. Elena drove slowly down the quiet street, the early sunlight stretching across the road ahead. In the rearview mirror, the house she once shared with Javier grew smaller with every second. The calm neighborhood faded behind her, while the open road carried her toward a future she had not yet imagined. Her hands rested firmly on the steering wheel. For the first time since the truth had revealed itself, her thoughts felt steady. The pain was still there, but so was a sense of control over the path ahead. As she approached the end of the street, Elena slowed near the stop sign and glanced once more into the rearview mirror. The Morales house stood far behind now, but something caught her attention. A car turned onto the street she had just left. It stopped in front of Javier's house. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly as she recognized the driver stepping out. Valeria. Elena hesitated. Across the quiet street, Javier stepped outside to meet her. And in that moment, Elena realized something about their midnight meetings that Javier had never told her.